And so we will divide the Q&A panel into two sections. The first one will be general questions for everyone of you to answer, depending on whether you like it or not. And the second one is directed, meaning that the person that I'll be asking is preferred to start, but then every one of you again is encouraged to answer the question as well. So the first question is version upgrades. When considering maintaining a long-standing client, the Fabric rewrite, and big changes between different versions, how do you decide when to upgrade a working app to a new version? Which version do you recommend upgrading to today? Matt, I think this is for you.
What I would say is that people who are shipping mobile apps generally have one time of year when they panic, whether they're using React Native or anything else. That is when new devices, new operating systems come out. And so, but if you only upgrade once a year to React Native, then the difference of things you have to deal with is much, much larger. And so something that I do, because I'm an insane nerd, is that I kind of monitor the React Native GitHub repo, the commits that are happening, and React as well. And if I see something, I think that one of the teams that I work with that's shipping React Native apps is going to cause them a problem, I kind of let them know ahead of time. And so one of the things that we've been talking about on the kind of core contributors is trying to basically make it so that new device season doesn't have major surprises in it, so that people can jump on that React Native update. And if they've been kind of updating once a quarter or so, that that point in the year should be relatively smooth, since they have the platform holders themselves kind of shooting at their feet and making them dance. So the rest of the stack shouldn't either.
All right. It's a tough question, so it's not a surprise, not many people willing to answer. So thank you for that. And so the other question is about our competing frameworks. So how do you see the future of the platform comparing with other platforms like, actually it's a framework probably. So how do you see the future of React Native comparing with other frameworks like Flutter, Kotlin Native, and maybe others not listed here?
Does anyone know anyone who's actually using Flutter for anything other than, test applications? Because I've been to a lot of iOS and Android meetups, and I haven't really encountered anyone who's actually using it. So hands up anyone who does active Flutter development here. I know this is a biased audience. Just thought I'd want to throw that one out there.
So one of the best things I think that React Native has is its community. So Flutter is pretty new and the community is rather small. And if you look at what goes into a technology, it's the developments that come with it. And right now you have a lot of apps in production in React Native that work fairly well, like Facebook Marketplace. You can't really tell it was made in React Native until somebody tells you. As far as I know, Flutter has had the Hamilton app demoed, and I'm sure it'll grow over like a matter of time, but the community just is not there yet. For Kotlin Native, I don't think it abstracts over UI kit, so then you'd have to have writing your platforms or your UIs in two different places, whereas in React Native, you'd be writing it in one, usually.
I want to add one more thing here. I think there's value in competition and other ideas. Flutter is taking a radically different approach than React Native. And it'll be interesting for us to see, as a community, what does the Flutter community value? Do they really value that they're rendering to GL, to something custom, and not using the native view attributes and the accessibility things that come as part of the platform? Maybe that's another option that we can provide in React Native. I think there's going to be a lot of things that we see. Maybe they have developer experience things that we haven't thought of. Competition is good. We probably should try it and understand what that has so that we can see what to bring to React Native.
All right, thank you for answering this question. And so next question is about contributing. So how do you find time or make it a habit to contribute to the open source community, especially when you have a job already?
Facebook pays me to do it.
I feel like that's actually a question Mike himself should answer, since he technically doesn't get paid to manage releases and like make the CI, fix the CI every time it breaks and stuff like that. He has help from Hector and a lot of the rest of the community, some of which are Facebook employees and some not. But I feel like I almost want to hear like what your well-polished answer to that question is, because genuinely you do weeks and weeks of work sometimes to like get a release out, and it's almost a Sisyphean task where you're like pushing the rock up the mountain and then it just rolls back down the mountain, and you have to take time off from clients who aren't paying you explicitly to do releases, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that also my girlfriend probably could answer.
Okay, sorry.
You know, so these days, when I'm working at Callstack, we were fortunate enough to have a special dedicated time at work. But before that, I mostly spent my free time. And I just got addicted to doing open source. And so it felt like my hobby. So I would find myself just sitting after work, doing stuff. I mean, it's just a habit. So back in the day, I also didn't get paid. And these days, I just do it as a hobby. But I think there is generally an ongoing discussion, right, how we can benefit from open source work, and some initiatives like Patreon and other websites where you can get paid for doing that. And I know a lot of people are having accounts there. For example, I guess Kant from JS podcast, right? He was having an account there as well. So that's potentially one way of getting paid. Or you can get paid to fix bugs that your library goes for clients, which is also a good thing.
I think it goes hand in hand, depending upon kind of job you are. Sometimes you're working on a problem and there is no solution, there is no package there. So you have to build it and then you contribute it back. Same goes when you blog, when you write books. There is also an opportunity there for you to improve your skill in a very short span of time. Because when you put something in public, you know that you're going to get a lot of feedback, and you learn it pretty quickly, which sometimes does not happen in your day-to-day job. So I think if you get good projects, good problems to solve in your day-to-day life, there's something which you will contribute back. So it's not that you need to get extra time outside your work. You can actually do it in regular Monday to Friday and just polish it, add documentation on weekend. That's the additional work you have to do. So I think that works for me.
Personally, a lot of the commits I make already go into open source repos, but on my own time that are like not Expo repos, where I find myself contributing is if you're working on a project and you're using somebody else's GitHub project, and then there's a bug, and you're like, okay, well, I can't make any progress unless if I fix this bug, and a lot of other people have opened issues for it, so you open up a PR. But I'd say what leads to me making that PR is how healthy that project is. So how easy is it for me to pull that project and make a change for it? Because like some people's projects is really gnarly and there's no way I can build it from source because you get some build error or whatever, but some are really healthy and it's easier to give back to a project like that than a project that you just pull and you're like, oh my goodness, what's going on?
I think like in a technical leadership role also, like some people are like afraid to kind of put their toe out there, like they for whatever reason, and sometimes like I feel like the best thing that I can do is to, what I'll point out to people is like, hey, we submitted this PR and it got merged in 12 hours, and it got published, you know, however many days later, so they can realize how easy it is. And I find that sometimes like sometimes what I'll do is, while I'm looking through like the React or React Native repos, is I'll look for good first PRs or like things that are tagged that way, and then kind of mentally think like, who on the teams that I interact with could do this so that they can get their feet wet and just get over that first hump. And then typically, in my experience in working with open source for a very long time, once people get that first contribution in, they kind of get over their sort of stage fright a little bit. depending on the project, if the people are nice and the review comments are constructive and stuff like that. So I think that that's something also that like one can do as like a technical leader in a company or in a community for that matter, is just show like, hey, just go talk to people, or don't even fix a problem, just file an issue, just so that the other person, you know, the albino soccer mom who lives in Kansas, who happens to also be a React Native developer, knows that they aren't the only one ever who got that error message. That can also just be useful to know, like, oh, here's a thing. I'm not the only one having this problem, and then you can cyberstalk them and track down their Twitter and send them a DM and go like, hey, what did you do? Because you didn't put anything in the issue, and then, you know, maybe they didn't solve it, or maybe they did solve it, but they didn't re-engage because they ran out of time or something like that. And so I'd say just like encouraging people to reach out. Most people in these communities are really nice, and even if they don't have the time to help you right then, they'll give you encouraging words. But if you don't reach out, you won't get any positive vibes at all. You'll just be potentially very frustrated if you don't reach out in the first place.
All right, thank you very much. So we all probably remember and have read Airbnb article about React Native and their decision to sort of gradually replace it back with native code. So any one of you would like to comment on that article? As far as, whether it's something Airbnb super specific or generally doesn't work at scale, anything.
It was a very well-written article, and it went into a lot of detail, which I think I really appreciated. It tried to keep a neutral tone, and I think it succeeded very much in doing that. And so if you have some of the detailed issues that they laid out there, which I think took a lot of courage on their part, because some of those problems weren't technological problems, it wasn't a good fit for them for the reason that they detailed. And if those things apply to you, your team, and your org, then maybe you should take some of that advice or not. But I'd say that if your org or your teams don't have some of the challenges that their teams did or that their organization did when they wrote that and made those decisions, then you don't have to come to the same conclusion if you don't have the same trail of breadcrumbs, the same kind of logical reasons that they laid out.
The biggest takeaway for me was that, I agree, it was a very, very well-written article. Building a Brownfield React Native app is hard. Integrating it into an organization that is filled with native engineers and trying to get them to adopt React Native is hard. And I think that's the big takeaway that I got from the Airbnb article. They kind of focus on two different pieces. There's the organizational piece and the technical piece. And the technical piece is totally valid. There are a lot of challenges with React Native and Brownfield apps. Facebook has run into them trying to build all of our navigation systems and all the other things that you have to figure out in a Brownfield app. That's where a lot of Fabric comes from, is to solve a lot of these problems, a lot of the things that we are running into integrating React Native even deeper into native apps. David talked about being able to embed components into native views that are not owned by React Native. That is something that is very hard to do right now, and why we're doing Fabric. And so I think a lot of what we're doing will also really help solve the problems that Airbnb listed on the technical side. On the organizational side, I think as a community we need to figure out how to better communicate React Native to native engineers and make them not be allergic to the idea of JavaScript in their code base, and listen to the challenges that they have with React Native. Your entire talk was about the challenges with React Native in Brownfield apps, but I think we see that, and we're doing a lot of things at Facebook to make that better, and I think as a community, there's a lot we can do to make that better.
I'd just like to reiterate what the two other speakers have said, that article by Airbnb is probably one of the best postmortems that I've ever read on adopting a piece of infrastructure and it not working out. So hats off to Airbnb for taking the time and being courageous in writing that. I think one factor that people don't take into consideration is the amount of time that it takes to ramp up different developers and new technologies. So I do a lot of like training and mentoring with companies that are trying to adopt React Native. And a good rule of thumb, I would say, is that like engineers who come from a React background, they generally take, if they are experienced, about a week or two to get good at React Native because they're already familiar with the JavaScript ecosystem. They know about things like Redux, Redux Tongue, all of these different libraries and all that kind of stuff. Native developers like me, when I came to React Native, even though I had worked at Facebook and I was somewhat familiar with React, JavaScript wasn't that hard for me to learn. But at Facebook, you don't really have to choose as much from all of this sea of third-party libraries that you all have to do when you're building your web applications. Like, you know, I want to share state across screens. Which flavor of Redux should I use? Should I even use Redux at all? Should I use MobX? What is reselect? What is Lodash? All of these libraries that you accumulate and you know, to a native developer, if you're trying to ramp them up and teach them about all of that, it takes a long time. The other point that I would make is that mobile has been, or modern mobile has been around for what, like a decade at this time? If you are trying to do an organization at scale, if you're trying to have 30, 40 engineers working on an application, you need more experienced mobile engineers. React Native has not been a long time yet, so the pool of like people who've worked on really big applications, it's pretty small. So a lot of the problems that came out and stood out to me in the Airbnb application had more to do with you know, finding people who are used to working at scale with React Native, and also training and getting native engineers interested in React Native. I think what I see in my consulting work nowadays is that a lot of the new applications that are coming along, a lot of VC-funded companies are investing in React Native quite heavily because it's so expensive to hire experienced engineers, and you can get more per unit productivity out of your engineers if they go with React Native. So I think in a few years' time, maybe some more of the native ecosystem will be more amenable to React Native, and hopefully we won't have as much of the problems that Airbnb had.
So the founder of Expo, Charlie, he did write an article about when Airbnb did sunset away from React Native. And he shared some of our findings when we interviewed people on like, how they find React Native. And typically the people who are happiest with the platform are people who write greenfield applications, so they don't have all of this existing infrastructure to deal with. Or as also Harry said in his talk earlier, the other case where people are happy with is if they take it step by step and they use it for secondary screens like FAQ, and in addition to their infrastructure. Airbnb was doing a Brownfield application, and one thing they did cite was that they had all this native infrastructure and they had to bridge it all when they went through React Native, and that is a huge feat, and it's not easy. And I also feel that Airbnb going away from React Native is pretty scary because people would look at it and they'd be like, well, okay, Airbnb has invested so much in React Native, and I really like Lottie. They've made so many contributions and they're going away, and that's like, it shakes up a lot of people. And for their particular use case, it just wasn't suitable, but we see a lot of other bigger companies adopting React Native, like Microsoft. They're adopting it for like Microsoft Office. So like while there are companies like Airbnb that haven't had their use case fulfilled, there are new companies coming in and picking it up.
Right, thank you very much. So now we will switch to the second part, but I got one general question to each of you at the end. So the first question is targeted at Matt, but I'm pretty sure each of you will have something interesting to say in this matter. So Matt, and I'm also generally curious because I just realized I've never asked you this question as well. When you moved to PlayStation from your previous job, was React Native already there? And if not, how would you pitch React Native to an enterprise at such scale as PlayStation? And what were the problems maybe or issues you were facing in order to get that up and running?
They had already started rewriting the mobile app in React Native before I got there, and so I don't want to speak for that team because I wasn't there, but I want to say it took roughly a year for them to replicate the functionality in the native mobile apps in the React Native application. So if you go, and they shipped last October, November, that app update, PlayStation app mobile app users got, that was the update to React Native. And so if you go backward from there 1 year, it was a pretty early adoption in my opinion. But they made it work, and the experience is really awesome. But I take zero credit. That was all smart people that were already working at Sony Interactive before I got there.
All right. Okay. Ellie, this is a question for you. So this is regarding state of React Native talk that showed us where we are, what are the architectural changes. And one of the changes we're mentioning that it is being done in order to increase responsiveness of the interface as far as the gestures. So the question is, how does this go along with great work by Krzysztof Magiera, like React Native Gesture Handler? Especially, how does Facebook make sure the development done internally at Facebook is coordinated with the community? As far as, like the question is basically whether React Native Gesture Handler is not in conflict with the Fabric rewrite, which is sort of planning to solve the same problem, which is the responsiveness.
So I think they solve similar problems. I think the gesture handler work that Christoph has done is amazing, and we're fortunate to have a good relationship with him, that we've been talking about Fabric and had a lot of conversations here and in the past on how Fabric can help make that better. I don't think that Fabric replaces React Native Gesture Handler or makes it obsolete. I think there's a lot of things that Fabric will enable, but a lot of stuff that we can do now before that's ready, and things that we can do even more on top of that when it's here.
All right, thank you very much. I think we can also say here that the RFC process that we have now is also a good step towards making sure we do not work against each other. Yeah. Okay. Queen, this is a question for you. So Expo is surely interacted with a lot of newbie developers, right? So what do you see as the bigger stress source issue that they face while diving into mobile development?
Okay, so a couple things. One thing that we see a lot, like when I go to hackathons, I'm like, hey guys, let's use Expo, and people have never really seen React Native before. They'll see that there's this package.json, and they'll be like, oh, well, it's managed by this thing called NPM, and anything on there I can pull down and it'll work. And oftentimes it's not the case. Like there's a lot of polyfills that are available in a lot of other engines that aren't available in JavaScript core. And a lot of thing that trips people up is this thing called toLocale string that's not in JavaScript core, but is in V8. So when people run the Chrome debugger, they'll be like, hey, this thing runs in the debugger, but it does not run in my code, and I don't really know why that is. From a non-technical perspective, one thing that does scare people is when we say, hey, when we go to companies and we're like, hey, use Expo, use React Native, and then they have this obscure part of their code, like say, for example, they want to write a specialized CUPS protocol. And they'd be like, well, can I write that in JavaScript? And we'll be like, no, you have to write it in native code. And then for somebody who's new to mobile development, they'll be like, okay, well, I don't really know anything yet, but I have to write this thing in JavaScript, and then I have to detach, and I have to write it in Android and iOS. And that's really scary, because you have to also interface between all of these platforms. And I'd be really excited to see, as the community matures, the probability of dropping down to the native level being less and less. Because when people don't have to drop down to the native level, it makes it so much more convenient to stay in JavaScript.
All right, thank you. So next question is for Harry. And So what navigation solution would you recommend for brownfield apps?
Roll your own seems to be the answer. You know, pretty much if you're trying to integrate React Native into an existing application that's complicated, it probably has its own navigation system, and you're going to have to customize that to work with React Native. I do know that Michael, one of the Pinterest engineers, I believe he is working on some sort of generalized solution to help with this process, but unfortunately I think this is going to be a case-by-case thing, you know, and you're probably going to have to roll your own a little bit.
All right, I'm not sure if any one of you has been also writing Brownfield. Matt, I guess you were also doing Brownfield.
No, well, so there was some native code that they had from the previous version of the mobile application, and I think they did what a lot of people do, is that they just encapsulated those things in native modules, and then was able to call them from the JavaScript into React Native. So, sorry, no, I don't have anything else to add. So it's not Brownfield precisely. I mean, Brownfield is where like I have one screen that's native, and then I have a sub screen that's React Native, right? And that's not what the PlayStation app does.
Okay. All right. So next question is to Arshad, and so you are working for a quite big digital agency, right? And so these agencies usually tend to have a grasp of market shifts and be able to sort of tell the trend. So the question is whether you have perceived anything on the React Native pulse, whether it's increasing, decreasing, especially after the Airbnb article.
So we already had a discussion on the Airbnb article, and so that is something what happens with the whole hype-driven development when architects come to conference or read blogs and they take decision based on someone else's problem. So if you're building something like Airbnb, then you can get influenced by that article. But it depends what kind of an app and what kind of a problem you're solving. There are a handful of applications which are doing what Airbnb is doing or what Uber is doing. So always gauge what kind of a problem you're solving. So I generally pitch it like there is Maslow hierarchy of needs for humans. There's security in the pyramid. There is having family. There is sex, and then there is higher consciousness. I have a similar kind of a pyramid when I look at where my problem, my application lies. Whether it's an MVP, it's a minimum marketable product, it's certain kind of a scalable application, or it's something as huge as maybe Airbnb or Uber. So where does your application fall? And then you have to take a decision. Of course, such blogs make it tough if the client has read it. Because then they have proof that, and then we have to come up with a solution that, because when building an app, it's not just about technology. There are a lot of human problems and human equations also in place. So the best team construction would be, even for React Native, I push for is also have some native developers on the team so that they can coach the JavaScript developers to the world of native iOS and Android and vice versa. And that makes pretty successful deliveries. So, so far, Airbnb hasn't had any effect for me. So React Native is going pretty strong, and it's so far way ahead than any of the other options like Flutter or even Xamarin. The competition is still not here, because I think the JavaScript community itself is huge. So React Native is going pretty strong. So at least I'm investing my next half a decade on React Native. So after that, I think I'll move on.
All right. So now that I have you here, I'll ask you another question about the accessibility. So following up to your talk, and it is also something that I've been thinking, because clients that I used to work with, not all of them were sold on the concept of accessibility. Many of them were looking at it as an unnecessary development blocker, and I think that's the case for, unfortunately, many projects. So the question is whether this is the case for your projects, and if yes, what would be your elevator pitch to sort of be able to implement accessibility?
Yep, and that was the reason, even in my presentation, I mentioned a couple of points which you can use it as a pitch to your customers. Else, if it's not necessary to tell everything to the client, there can be some delight features always. So it's important that the culture of the team changes and embraces something like accessibility. Unless, and especially with React Native, it's quite straightforward. It's not very complicated. And usually the developer community, they do appreciate things like accessibility. But yet it's a tough call to sell it to clients, because many clients are only interested in their minimum viable products. And they say that is going to be used by a handful of people, and the app might retire. So why do we even need to put a little bit of extra effort? But I think in that case, we can always seduce our development team into building an accessible app. Because sometimes because of your deliverables, even the client is not even interested if you put some extra time or hours for including test-driven development. They're fine. They just deliver me something pretty quickly. So I think you have to bring it in the culture of the team itself.
Okay, thank you. And how about our other panelists? Do you have accessibility implemented in your apps? Yes, no, and why?
Well,
we've been focusing a lot more on accessibility at Facebook, and Marketplace, as we've talked about before, being used by over 800 million users every month. Accessibility is really important, and so in the latest release, I think we had, or in one of the RCs, I don't remember, some new accessibility props were released. One of the things I'm really excited about, but probably not other people, a new prop for Vue that when you use the accessibility inverted mode, it will not invert the images. Doesn't seem like it's that useful, except in rooms like this. If I use my phone, I turn it into accessibility inverted mode, and then images look normal. So if you have images in your app, you should probably pass that prop. That's a tangent, but accessibility.
So Facebook's F8 conference application, that can be a go-to place if you want to look at all these major props. They're getting used there. So, of course, Facebook is making it so. In their apps, it's already there.
We have audits that check Marketplace and file tasks, and if there are places that are not just product code where they need to add more props, then we get them and have to figure out how do we change our API to support that. So first line of defense for accessibility is Facebook having to fix accessibility.
Going to Yanni's talk from earlier about kind of having a vision for yourself, like what are you really doing with your time? I think that accessibility and kind of diversity and inclusion are things that motivate me in a very deep way. Because I wouldn't be here if it weren't for diversity and inclusion getting better in the world over, not like when I was younger. So something that motivates me in a lot of my work that I try to advocate for with teams that I work with is, imagine the person on one side of the planet, like in Nigeria or whatever, and they're having a really empowering experience playing some game like Star Wars Battlefront 2 or The Last of Us or whatever. And it's one thing to have an interactive medium where you can feel it empowers you, and it kind of, I think, allows you. I always felt like being a gamer allowed me to make certain mental leaps or whatever. I could picture myself in a situation, and then that's a big part of making a situation happen, is being able to picture yourself there in the first place. And that's cool, but even cooler is when they can share that experience on the same kind of level playing field as all of the other people in the world, and they can then get an even more empowering experience when somebody gives them 10,000 thumbs ups or likes on their the screenshot of video that they took of the 1 in a billion random occurrence where they were playing as Darth Vader and a TIE fighter was coming down and they threw the lightsaber at it. It hits the TIE fighter and it crashes into the thing. That doesn't be that's still like the most amazing, oh my God, like powerful experience. But now you're sharing that with the world, and I think that makes the world a smaller place in a great way. So that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about gaming in general. But it's one of the great things about working in a company like PlayStation is that you can, if you stop and take a look at why you're doing what you're doing, that's the kind of impact that you can have on individuals, and then that seeps out into a kind of a greater community of bringing people together, but also making people feel empowered so they can picture themselves in better circumstances if they aren't in great circumstances now. And that's a big part of kind of like raising that glass ceiling, or in some cases eliminating it, where people's limitation is that they can't picture themselves in a better situation. So I'm really passionate about accessibility, diversity, inclusion for that reason, and a lot of my colleagues at PlayStation are also very passionate about it and do internal tech talks on how to make the PlayStation Store and the web properties more accessible and stuff like that.
All right, thank you very much for those answers. So I have one closing question. Wait, let me find it here. So many questions. Okay. So imagine that you have one wish granted, and it has to be React Native related. What would you ask?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
If you could think of like one thing you would change with React Native, or you would like to see one thing in React Native, and you would knew that it's gonna happen, like your wish, what would that would be?
I would say the dream state that we have to write code really once, and it works seamlessly in both iOS and Android. So I think that is one thing. That's I think is the dream, that it could happen one day. And maybe later some. That's not related. I thought about drag and drop, but that's not related here. So.
Off the top of my head, I'd say better debugging. But when somebody says you have one wish, you say for your wish, you say, oh, I want a dozen more wishes. So going on that tangent, I'd say I wish that there were more companies that adopted React Native so that they churn out more features and optimization, so you really get like 12 things.
Wow, that was a pretty smart move, wishing for 1,000 wishes. No, since I started using React Native, like it's improved so much in the last year or two alone. And I just want to say thank you so much to all the core contributors here and Mike for all their great work that you do. One thing that I would like to see is that when pull requests or issues get filed, especially issues where people submit pull requests to fix the issue, that they get closed and merged a bit quicker. And maybe the way to do that, and I know you guys are thinking about this, is to get other large companies involved and maintaining React Native. But again, you know, it's a small wish, but that would be what I would like to see.
I also was thinking I'd wish for 1,000 more wishes. I only get one. I wish I want to see us continue building up the community for companies that use React Native to talk about their experiences with React Native, for native engineers who try React Native to talk about their experiences with React Native, help us make it better, help us continue collecting and accepting contributions. This is turning into more than one wish. But really it's building up the community, because we can continue building what we need to build, but if people aren't happy with it, if people don't want to use it, that's what we really need to make sure is sustainable for the future.
I think that, not to be trite, but I think this is the year of like wishes coming true in React Native. And so starting an RFC-like process proposals and discussions is a big step in the right direction to telegraph things instead of just giant commits dropping into the repo overnight. And I have not seen one of those reverted to date, no matter what the impact is on the users. So that should help ameliorate that. It started upstream in React with suspense and async rendering. And as soon as I saw that land upstream, I could foresee how that would help some of the constraints that React Native has today. That has not been a showstopper for any of the applications, React Native applications that I have worked on, but it was one of the ones for some of what Airbnb was dealing with, for instance, that they detailed in their article. And so as Fabric starts to land and they start to flip on the switches to turn on async rendering of React in React Native in a way that integrates intelligently, in a way, a lot of the issues that we have with battery life or too many things going over the bridge or just being able to set the priority on things going over, synchronous things going over the bridge is huge. And so I'd say that wish is like at the halfway mark of being fulfilled, just because it's not an open source, usable in open source yet. So there's been a whole bunch of like little things along the way that have been like these little quality of life improvements since like, the dark days of React Native 43 when the world almost ended. So things are so much better now, but if I had one wish, it would be that no Facebook commit lands in GitHub when the CI is read, as just a real practical matter. And then as a sub note to that if Facebook commit does land in the open source GitHub master, the person who broke it has to be the one who fixes it. And this gets back to what I was saying about you and Hector earlier. Spend a lot of your time fixing commits or trying to make them work when it wasn't a problem that you created. And I don't think that's fair. There's a disparity there, I think. That being said, it is Facebook's project, and we should all be thankful that they put so much effort into that. But I think also just the other wish that came true this year that should help this as well is the React Native open source team at Facebook getting more resources, getting more leadership, great leadership in Sophie, who was a part of doing a lot of great things for the React community, because the React community also had some turbulence as well, and that I think has worked out really beautifully. So I think most of my wishes, except for the commits landing one, are all basically coming true. So I'm just going to keep doing that, whatever mental process I'm doing that's making these things come true. But a big part of those things coming true is just reaching out and just having frank, sometimes not difficult, but frank conversations with people and going like, this isn't cool. What are we going to do about it? And going like, how can we work together to make this solution together? And I think one thing that really helps with some of these difficulties is realizing that these Facebook employees who are participating in open source, they're operating under the same constraints of their organization and where it is now versus where they want it to be, as you are in your job, where maybe you don't have the utopian job and there's constraints you're operating under that you wish were different. And so I think just being authentic with people when you reach out and go like, how are we going to solve this problem, can be really helpful. And the RFC process opens that door even wider so that there can be hopefully even more people doing that, so that even more of these gaps get closed even faster.
All right, thank you very much. That wasn't an easy question. I appreciate the creativity here. So I also feel like I can answer that, so it's not that just I'm asking you hard questions. So my wish would be probably for the CI to stay green forever and never be red again. Which is happening sometimes when I wake up, so it's not that bad. All right, so that's it. Thank you very much for taking part in the panel, for answering the questions from the community. Some of them were hard, some of them were easier. Once again, thank you very much. Great applause for our panelists.